CGTN, China Global Television Network.
As carbon emissions continue rising globally at alarming rates, the movement for holding polluters financially accountable for the damage they have caused is growing. But without significant political or economic leverage, African countries have struggled to make climate reparations a reality. So, what options do small and vulnerable states have? This week on the program, we explore the question of climate cash, where the money is, who holds the purse strings, and how Africa can be paid what's due. I'm Penina Karibe. Welcome to Talk Africa. The African continent is responsible for an estimated 3 to 4% of global carbon emissions, but it stands out disproportionately as the most vulnerable region in the world. Conversely, the global north is estimated to produce over 90% of these emissions. Climate change has had a huge and destructive impact over large swathes of the continent in the last few years. Much of Africa has warmed by over 1 degree Celsius in the last century, resulting in changing weather patterns which threaten food productivity and water security. Around Africa, we can feel the rising temperatures, and we have witnessed the changing rainfall patterns. Lack of water due to failing rains and shrinking lakes and rivers is yet another consequence. It's estimated to affect about 250 million people on the continent and will displace up to 700 million by the year 2030. Now, one of the largest disasters linked to climate change that has hit Africa in the recent past was Cyclone Idai. It devastated vast areas of southern Africa with flooding and high winds, displacing hundreds of thousands of people and causing about $150 million worth of damage in Mozambique alone. According to the Africa Development Bank, the continent is losing 5 to 15% of its per capita economic growth due to the effects of climate change. Climate change has also resulted in increased desertification, melting glaciers, crop failures, and death of livestock as its destructive impact across Africa continues. Joining me now to take a closer look at the question of climate change financing are from London, Isabel Hilton, the founder of China Dialogue, an organization focused on climate change. From Johannesburg, we have Nhlanhla Sibisi, the climate and energy expert at Greenpeace Africa. And from Nairobi, Dr. Linda Ogallo, climate adaptation expert at the Intergovernmental Authority for Development, IGAD. Welcome everyone to the program. So, Dr. Ogallo, I will begin with you. You have worked in several countries across the region, helping communities build resilience through access to climate information and various adaptation strategies. From what you have seen, how has climate change affected Africa?
Africa is one of the few places where when you talk to climate change to people who do not even understand or can articulate it in a scientific way, they can say it in their own ways and how the climate has changed. If you talk to local farmers, they'll tell you we used to be able to plant this and get this amount of produce, but because the rains are not coming as frequently, the droughts are becoming more severe, we're not able to get as much as we used to. So in as much as you don't tend to get a lot of climate change deniers in Africa, because almost everybody can feel the impacts and articulate it in their own way, even when they can't give you the scientific definition.
Right. So, Nhlanhla, how much does Africa need to mitigate these impacts and build adaptation?
Without focusing on the figures, but one thing that we know in terms of the adaptation that we need is it's quite enormous. And if you take into consideration that the manner in which we as the African continent tend to have the resilience to adapt after all of these extreme weather events, you would find that one of the reasons why that we are far behind is because we don't have adequate financing. We don't have the infrastructure in place that actually has the resilience to withstand, all of these extreme weather events that we are seeing. So it definitely goes to say that we need to go back and review the agreements that have been made at the Paris Agreement. What were the undertakings that were made, especially by the richer countries or the countries that have actually had the advantage of developing at the expense of the climate, by the way, and find ourselves when we go to the next COPs, as we are saying that the COP that's coming up in Egypt should now be a COP of action as opposed to a COP of negotiations.
So, Isabel, let's pick it up from where Ntlantla has left it, because on average, Africa requires $250 billion each year to address its climate-related needs. And yet, in 2020, what came in was only $30 billion. That's about 12% of the amount needed. Now, in September, African ministers meeting in Cairo released a statement saying Africa got less than 5.5% from the global kitty. Where is the money?
Well, it's a good question. And I don't disagree that there isn't enough money. I think in terms of the distribution, though, Africa, it depends on the fund. Some of the money is in a thing called the Adaptation Fund, which was finally launched in 2007. And in its first decade, it was helping countries to build adaptation programs, helping with specific projects, helping also to design policies, because adaptation is a very local specific thing. Every country needs, every place needs its own model for its own conditions. So that was a start. It was a relatively small start. Then the Green Climate Fund, which prioritizes the least developed countries and the small island developing states. Now, African countries have had a substantial share of that because they're amongst the most vulnerable and the least developed. So Asia Pacific, 83 countries benefit. In Africa, 81 countries benefited from that. And again, that's the question is not so much the allocation, but the overall size of the cake. And one of the difficulties that we've had in between COP26 and COP27, in February, Russia invaded Ukraine and the global economy's taken another enormous hit, particularly quite important donor countries in Europe, because it's disrupted energy supplies, it's disrupted food supplies, it's disrupted the markets. And there's just going to be less money as long as this war goes on.
Climate change is something we've covered every time, every now and then. And that, it just seems to me that every year what we hear, especially we journalists in Africa, what we hear from African countries is, where is the money? Where is the money? Climate financing has become a chorus. And so what is it really though? Why is this song sung every single year? What is going on?
Well, if you look, I agree that we hear that every year, but actually, if you look at the history of climate financing, a great deal has happened since, for example, the Kyoto Protocol, but it hasn't always benefited Africa. So under the Kyoto Protocol, for example, the Clean Development Mechanism was set up, and that was largely focused on helping developing countries move from dirty industries to clean industries, from dirty energy to clean energy. That was financed by developed countries, and it was very substantial. But because Africa had less industry than China, for example, China was by far the biggest beneficiary. So there have been substantial transfers of funds in the past. And in the first phase, at least, they went towards mitigation because that was, as it were, it still is very the real urgent problem. And there's always been a conflict with limited funds between mitigation and adaptation. And in that conflict, Africa has tended to lose out. But I would say that the amount of adaptation that Africa will need or is needing now is very much determined by how high temperatures actually rise, and that's determined by mitigation. So it wasn't foolish to put money into mitigation, but now that we are well into climate impacts, it is equally important for the sake of vulnerable countries, many of which are in Africa, to up the funding for adaptation. And there is very much a consciousness of that. But as I say, we've had two massive hits to the global economy in the COVID pandemic and the Ukraine war, and it's not making things any easier. It was always a difficult conversation, and this is making it harder.
All right, so Dr. Ogallo, the chief economist at the African Development Bank, Kevin Chuka Urama, says Africa faces a climate financing gap of about $108 billion each year, each year. So how can countries be made to honor their obligations?
For those who control the money, when we talk about climate change, you'll notice that the narrative is we need to get the temperatures down before we get to critical levels, which is a very valid point. For African countries, for us, we're saying the problem is hitting us now, so we need the money now. But the challenge again with us as African countries, we're not united. We don't have a single position, and we don't speak in a unified voice. We tend to, our vote is split against different factions, and all of them are saying something different. So where are we going to get the money from? I think this is for African nations to begin to, one, prioritize how can we begin to come to a common understanding as the African nations, and then secondly, how can then we begin to look at different sources? Because like has been said, there is no money. Where's the money going to come from? The Russian war is showing us that the money that we are relying on is no longer available. If you look at most economies are suffering from inflation. So as much as we want to keep talking about the loss and damage, and we should keep talking about the loss and damage, I think if your people are dying right now because of a climate crisis, we have to begin to look at even issues of development. How about the developmental funds? Because again, much of the problem that we're having in terms of adapting to climate change is vulnerability linked, which is also linked to poverty. So as long as we're not dealing with the issues of energy poverty, we're not dealing with issues of the need to begin to bring the development actors and development funding into the climate change conversation, I think we'll always get stuck trying to talk about where is the money, because the money is limited and the ones controlling the money also need it.
Right, and I think in response to that, and coming to you, Ntlantla, it would be for some of the African experts listening to what Dr. Gallo is saying, that everybody is going negotiating for their people, and it's interesting that the chief economist at the African Development Bank, said that, and I am quoting, climate finance structure today is actually biased against climate vulnerable countries. The more vulnerable you are, the less climate finance you receive. And I am thinking this goes against the very essence of creating this kitty. How does the structure work? Break it down for us.
Unfortunately, as the good doctor said, there's these conditionalities. This 8.5 billion that I'm referring to has a part of the tranche is actually soft loans, which means that the interest won't be high, but in any case, we have to pay it back. But it's meant to contribute towards reducing the effects of climate change. And if you look at that example just alone, it really emphasizes the point that the person who has the purse or is controlling the kitty really determines the terms. Till we get to actually structuring whether it's based on the negotiations, and yes, I agree that, when countries go and negotiate, they're negotiating for the position of who they stand for, and that is their countries. Or if they are negotiating as a bloc, whether it's a European Union or whatever, it's because of the interest of the people that they're representing. But it doesn't really address the fundamental problem of how do we address climate change, because climate change, unfortunately, does not have borders. We have seen that. We have seen with the recent floods, not only in the global south, but also in Germany, and we are seeing what's currently happening across the globe, whether it's in the US, we've seen that happening, and on the African continent, it's what we are living, as the good doctor said, it's what we are actually going through on a daily basis, whether we have a name for it or we don't have a name. So that tells you that the way that the funding is structured. And I do accept that we are going through an inflationary process now because of the different geopolitical events that are actually happening. But the issue of climate change has been on the tables for decades, and it's still going to be there whether there is war or whether there is no war. Now, we need to find a way around that in addressing it and understanding that from an African perspective, how can we really make it a matter of emergency, as we are in a climate emergency, to say that we need to address these issues. Otherwise, there are going to be nations that will not exist anymore because of the migratory pattern that are resulting from climate change and the utter destruction that's happening, as was given the example of Cyclone Idai. We've seen that in Durban, we've seen that in Mozambique, we've seen that even going further as far as Zimbabwe. So we need to get to a point where we are addressing this issue with the determination that it requires us to apply.
All right, so we're going to take a short break now, and when we come back, we'll have more on climate financing and what Africa can do to slow down the effects of climate change. Stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. So with me are Isabel Hilton, Ntlantla Sibisi, and Dr. Linda Ogalo. Before the break, we looked at some of the impact climate change has had on the continent. Let's now look at how Climate Cash would be able to mitigate some of these effects across Africa. Dr. Ogalo, in the Rotterdam Summit, the Global Center and Adaptation CEO said success in Egypt will depend on whether Africa's needs are met or not, and that Africa has the commitment and the plan. What is Africa's agenda for this year's COP27 summit?
I think usually with negotiations like this, African nations keep their position close to the vest because, again, you do not want to give up your position ahead of the negotiation to give the other side time to react or to prepare. So I know the one that we have been very vocal about as a continent is on loss and damage and ensuring that the climate finance is flowing towards adaptation, like you have mentioned.
Well, one of the challenges that Africa faces is that the countries do not speak in a unified voice. And so I was just curious to know what is big on Africa's agenda now? I mean, what is Africa looking for?
I think, like you rightly put it, if you listen to a lot of the leaders, we are talking about the loss and damage, about the fact that if you look at the Horn of Africa right now, we have parts of the region that are going into the fifth failure in terms of rainfall, 5 failing seasons of rainfall. Countries like Somalia are in the process of almost having a famine. So issues of climate finance is one thing that you'll hear across from most of our African leaders, is how can we then strategize to ensure that the finances that are intended for the region are getting to the region. Because even if you get out of the traditional mechanisms for climate finance provided by UNFCCC and look at the philanthropic financing that's coming into climate change, even there's only about 3% been directed towards adaptation. So I think for the African leaders, at least for the African people, because for right now, just like the globe is beginning to see, we're seeing significant impacts when we talk about climate impacts with droughts and flooding as well. So for our leaders that are struggling right now, even as a result of the current global crisis, financial crisis, they need to begin to talk about how do we get more access to the finance so that we can continue development, and so that climate or climate impacts is not setting us back in terms of the developmental agenda.
Okay, so Ntlantla, what is Africa already doing to mitigate and adapt to climate change?
Individual countries are taking action on the ground, and I would say that thanks also to civil society, because we've been making quite a lot of noise to actually unpack the science. I mean, we continue to work on unpacking what the science means, not only for the sake of awareness to people, but also to governments to make sure that they're taking this situation quite seriously. And I would say that we need to commend different countries that are taking action, whether it's through their transition programs, like in the case of South Africa. But unfortunately, we are not doing enough because we do lack, to a certain degree, some level of expertise that will actually take action on the ground. Yes, we can continue applying our indigenous knowledge systems as we have been doing in some rural areas, but we also do need a certain level of funding. And also, just to add to what has been talked about, our agenda when it comes to the upcoming COP, loss and damage is really becoming an issue. And what we are actually discovering now, to some it may seem like it's a new thing or a new position, but it has been there. It's just that there hasn't, most of the African countries had not really rallied behind loss and damage. We have to have a position that is clearly mapped out and that clearly articulates steps in terms of how do we move with regards to loss and damage.
But Isabel, let me come to you. Much of Africa's climate financing is from public actors. Why isn't the private sector involved?
You're absolutely right. I mean, if you look at the balance, it's about 65% public. Then there's about 45 in loans, and private investment is a very small percentage. And private investment, I have to say, was always thought to be part of the promised 100 billion. So we have failed to mobilize private investment as we should have. Part of it is, I think, private investment not understanding opportunity, but also the question of risk. So private investment won't go where it considers the risks are too high. So what we need is a combination of public finance, which mitigates the risk and blends with private finance to do things like building renewable energy in Africa. Africa has massive solar resources. It could be a real powerhouse. It could have an energy system for the future and not one for the past. And, you know, we do have African leaders and African entrepreneurs who are thinking that way. But we haven't been very effective so far at producing the kind of blend of private and public finance that really, you know, puts turbocharges this kind of development. But it certainly could happen. It won't happen just with public money, because for reasons we've discussed already, that's going to be tighter than it was. But there is private finance, there is private investment potential. And it's a matter of lining up the risk mitigation, the insurance, and the opportunity.
And Dr. Ogallo, what are the opportunities that exist for green investment in Africa for the private sector?
Increasing access, energy access, and solving the energy poverty conversation, because the one thing that we have as an advantage for Africa, I think we're about 50% in terms of electrification, give or take. So when you talk about the West and the West moving to green energy, it means they have to change the entire infrastructure, because most of them already have access to energy. But for Africa, if we begin to look at our people as markets and for energy companies, for example, if we begin to engage the private sector, the one thing that we have as a nation is social capital. I mean, as a continent is social capital. We have the numbers, our youth bulge is continuing to increase. So we need to begin to invest in the capacity of rural people, of rural communities, help them industrialize, engaging the private sector. And of course, it has to do with increasing energy access. Because as much as we're talking about, yes, we have been impacted by climate change now, our biggest issue is poverty. Our vulnerability issue is as a result of poverty. And there's no way we can do that without access to energy, access to technology. And as much as we would love to do that in a clean way, the reality might be that if we want to get our nations industrialized and developed, to give them a chance to adapt and to get out of that poverty cycle, we might have to do it in a way that is not pleasing to the global community, so to speak. There needs to be a sincere conversation in terms of this is where we are and what are we willing to do to prioritize our people ahead of the global community, which is what the West does all the time. So African leaders need to really think about how to get the people out of poverty, which is the biggest issue when it comes to vulnerability. And we can't do that without energy access. We might not be able to do that without contributing to emissions.
Right. And as we finish this conversation, this is a question I'm going to ask each one of you, starting with you, Isabel. So should this money that Africa has been looking for, should it come, how should it be distributed?
Morally, the case would be for the most vulnerable and to alleviate the impacts. But there is also the other case that if you want real resilience, then we need to invest. We need to invest, and how we need to invest. For example, if you're a development agent, does a country need an airport or a good urban drainage system? You know, these are really important decisions that have to be made, and we still tend to go for the more sort of glamorous and perhaps old-fashioned option, where it's actually what we need, a resilience. So I think the money should go to resilience.
Right. So what about Lantla? Or what do you think? I mean, we look at your country, South Africa. It's Africa's most industrialized economy. And then you look at a country like Mauritania, for instance, or Chad. So when we talk about distribution of these funds, what should be the criteria?
We have one of the highest solar radiations on the planet, and unfortunately we are not as deliberate as we were during the COVID pandemic, where we were able to come up, with stimulus packages that's actually going to boost our energy sector and create our own manufacturing capabilities, whether it's with solar panels or your wind turbines, etc. So I think we should move away from that myth, because we're actually holding ourselves back, and we are not deliberate, we are not ambitious enough to start producing these solar farms or these wind farms that that we have seen. Unfortunately, Germany is far leading than South Africa yet when it comes to radiation. So, solar radiation, that is South Africa is quite ahead. So in terms of actually where we need to be going, and we need to start being deliberate in terms of us moving forward, to start in our own corners, in our different countries, depending on the capabilities, the funding that we're having, that we start laying out these projects. Like in the case of South Africa, we have what we refer to as a just transition program. It's now intentionally trying to look at, because we have a high coal profile. How do we move these coal producing workers to now get into the renewable sector? And that's the just transition that unfortunately that we need to we need to go through if we want to bring down our emissions. So it means that we need to be deliberate, we need to be ambitious. And yes, as Greenpeace Africa, we are asking for all of us to put the wheel to the shoulder and start thinking in a different way in which we can start applying these different projects on the ground.
And Dr. Ogallo, what are your final thoughts on distribution of this climate finance?
I think like the loss and damage conversation goes, you have to be, like I said earlier, you have to have a framework for loss and damage, which quantifies what the losses are. So ideally, if you're paying out a policy based on damage, then ideally, it should, the level of damage should determine the level of payout, ideally. So most of the countries that might be getting, if you look at the impacts, not as bad or high numbers in terms of the numbers of people impacted, a lot of it has to do with adaptive capacity, which is linked to poverty. So then do you give South Africa, that's a bit ahead, the same amount of money that you give Somalia, for example, that might not be impacted by cyclones as much as the Southern Africa, but needs it a lot more? Do you then prioritize it that way? And I think ideally there's two factors. Do you look at who's most impacted by virtue of the fact that they have nothing, or do you look at who has the capacity to bounce back faster? So it's a difficult decision, and I'm also glad I'm not part of the ones making it.
I agree with you. Well, I think this is a very interesting topic that we could go on about for forever, I think. But we have to close it at some point, and this is it. That is all for this edition of Talk Africa. A very big thank you to all our guests. Isabel Hilton, founder of China Dialogue, an organization focused on climate change. We had Nklatla CBC, climate and energy expert at Greenpeace Africa. And we also had Dr. Linda Ogallo, climate adaptation expert at the Intergovernmental Authority for Development, IGAD. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and Twitter. You can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. Do keep the conversation going and join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Penina Karibe, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, it's goodbye.